pray. Open our eyes, our minds, and our hearts to experience you in a deep, fresh, and new way as we march toward Christmas. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
So here we are at the start of an Advent journey. It's great to have this conversation for the next 4 sessions and immerse ourselves in the biblical texts around the stories of Jesus, the classic hymns of the faith, particularly Christmas carols, in an experience we're calling Almost Christmas, a Wesleyan Advent Experience. The 4 key words that are traditionally used for Advent will be our guiding words too. Peace in session 1, and then hope in session 2, and then love, and then finishing with joy. But it's that first word, the Wesleyan Advent Experience, that will be the converging factor for all that we're talking about, particularly with something that John Wesley talked about, a difference between the almost and the altogether. How would we describe that difference between the altogether and the almost?
It's almost like when Jesus is speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well, there's a difference between water and living water, right? Altogether, Christmas is the depth of the well. That means the water is sustainable and will always be there, as opposed to an almost, which might quench our thirst immediately, but we have to keep going back.
To be able to live into love and to be able to live into joy and to be able to live into peace and hope, and where that source comes from, how I am filled, that with Christ and through the hope of Christ coming, or with the joy of Christ coming, that is the altogether that lingers.
When we think about how we can tend to function in isolation and we can be an almost, or we're performing our best work or church or family selves, and then we neglect community with each other, like John Wesley and his band groups, or community and engagement with God. So this Wesleyan theme of moving from almost to altogether, I think, is moving us from trying to do everything ourselves to trying to do everything in relationship with God and with each other.
What April said really captures it for me. The difference between the almost and the altogether really is a matter of performance. For the almost, it's about how we perform. It's about what we do, what we manufacture to create peace, hope, love, and joy. For Wesley, the altogether Christian is about what God is performing within a person. Our hope over these next 4 sessions is that with each phrase, with each word, people will draw more and more deeply in love with God and in love with others. And it's not so much about what we do to make it happen, but our openness to allowing God to make it happen in us. That's our hope anyway. And it begins with peace, an almost peace.
So in almost peace, it's kind of like during Jesus' time, the Pax Romana. It was peaceful, but it was peaceful out of violence. No one stepped out of line. There was less crime, but it was a stronghold. And it's called the Roman peace. How do we transition into that kind of Jerusalem kind of peace from almost to altogether?
Well, there is a biblical vision as an alternative to the kind of peace you're describing. Not a peace that is born out of coercion or domination, a peace that we call Shalom. That is the most dominant concept for peace in the entire Bible. It's the kind of peace that Jesus talked about when he said in the Gospel of John, "My peace I leave with you." When you wish Shalom for someone, you're not simply saying, "I hope your problems go away," or "I hope your conflicts stop," or "I hope the troubles settle down." What you are saying is, I wish for you, and I join you in seeking the fullness and best health and prosperity and well-being for your life. It is a completely other-oriented sentiment. And if you can establish that first within yourself, in the work that God does within you, and then have it shape your relationships with other people, that's the foundation for shalom communities, and eventually a biblical vision for a shalom-filled world. In a world filled with so many problems and suffering and brokenness, we can be the conduits to help other people resolve their toughest questions about where God is in the midst of their own suffering.
as we're thinking about what peace means, moving from an almost to an altogether, we can have a surface level of peace in our lives. But the peace comes from the remembrance that God is with us in all times and in all places. So even if bad things happen, God doesn't necessarily make bad things happen. Our life is not an if-then set of choices or retaliation. But the fact is that bad things happen in our lives individually and in our communities. And yet God is with us even in the midst of challenges and in suffering. I think it can be helpful to surround ourselves with community so that when we are having silent moments or silent seasons in our lives or more challenging moments, we are around people who can remind us that God's peace is here for us even before we're even aware of God's presence in a certain situation.
Yeah, it reminds me of the importance of community when things like young children getting killed through gun violence, right? Or when we have a flood in Nashville, Tennessee, and it wipes out our whole city. Or we have fires in the Northwest. Those things they feel so overwhelming. That the communities that we're a part of, and when they gather, right? And when they say, I'm gonna hold peace in this space with you. And we are gonna do this together. And it doesn't feel so overwhelming anymore. Right. You know, I don't think it's one of those things that you can just say, 1, 2, 3, peace, right? Like, it's not just gonna happen. It's something that we work on, like you said, individually, within our own hearts, but also communally to say to each other, we're gonna hold each other accountable to peace.
In the chapter, we lift up Ephesians 4, where Paul says that we are called as Christians together in community to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And he offers some very practical ways, some very challenging ways for us to create interpersonal shalom in our relationships with other people, to speak the truth, which is really hard to do. We have to be clear about what we say and make sure that it's truthful, to practice empathy, to try to see the other person's perspective, not to get them to agree with you and not necessarily for you to agree with them, but at least to not dehumanize them, to not steal another person's humanity, to not pump up your own self-esteem at the expense of someone else's, and then to be forgiving and to be compassionate and to be kind. Those practical steps are really hard. And the great thing about being in Christian community is that we can ritualize it together, that we can create moments together where we can seek shalom for someone else. So are there experiences that we've had in communities where they've ritualized peacemaking within the community?
I have had seasons in my personal and professional life where things were just hard for a lot of reasons. And when I look back on those seasons, I had covenant small groups where we committed to gathering, and sometimes the conversation was deep and sometimes it was lighthearted, but it was in that intimate sharing where we all committed to showing up with everything that we had. But it was the presence of God that ordered our lives in such a way that we could do life together for a season. When I look back, that's what gave me a sustaining peace, because it was God's movement in our lives as we traveled together in the good moments and in the challenging moments.
Yes. We've had a lot of growth in our town lately, and it's been all in a very short period of time. So there's been a lot of conflict, specifically with different economic groups, right? A lot of folks have said, those people are panhandling too much, or those people are in my way and I always have to see them and they're always sitting in my park. And well, there was a bill that came up with our Metro Council that said, so then let's criminalize like those people, right? And so I offered to the council person, could we have some conversations? Could you defer the bill until we get different groups of people together in a conversation to listen to each other's experience of what the past 5 years has looked like in their life and how that has changed for each of them in this huge boom of development. So instead of criminalizing each other or instead of dehumanizing each other, like you said, like we are appreciating each other's humanity, and we are saying, this is what this stress and destruction has done to my life. I want to hear what it's done to your life. and let us then help to build a community where we can all exist in a space that is more altogether peace, right? We sort of can't even pretend right now that there's even an almost peace.
And John Wesley did the same thing with his band groups and with going out and preaching in unexpected places. He wasn't trying to find one particular group of people. He was trying to find people who would bring their truth and say, God has room for your truth, and that's where you can find peace.
I guess as we wind this session down, we sort of recap what we've discovered together about what peace is. It is not something you manufacture. It is not based on your performance. It is not acquiescing to cultural ideals of what peace means, which is simply just removing conflict. Peace is not something you achieve. First and foremost for us, it's something you receive. When Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you, I give to you not as the world gives," it begins with the peace that God has given to us in Jesus Christ, a reconciled relationship with God. That peace comes with it a responsibility to be peacemakers, not peacekeepers, to brush conflict under the rug, but to do the hard work, the hard interpersonal work of building peaceful relationships, particularly with people who are in conflict. That is an altogether peace, and that's the ideal for this Advent journey. Well, if your house is like mine, you have that certain junk drawer or that closet or that spot in the storage shed that you don't want anyone else to open. On the outside, your house might look calm and clean and happy, maybe even peaceful, but you know that deep below the surface, there's a lot of chaos going on. I think that's the case for peace, especially during Christmas time. We have these fantasized notions, that sort of Norman Rockwell setting where the family's gathered around a Christmas dinner table and everyone seems happy. We even like to think that the nativity, the manger, was tranquil and serene, where all was calm and all was bright. We try to project peace to other people. We take that conflict and we shove it into a junk drawer, or we try to anesthetize ourselves from the pain and the conflict and tranquilize ourselves with certain behaviors. That's really almost peace. That's not the kind of peace that Jesus comes to give us. He gives us an altogether peace. It's based on this one notion, that peace is not something we create, it is something we receive. It is a gift from God. If you want peace on the outside, it begins with peace from God and with God on the inside. That's what we are to receive during this Advent season, an altogether peace that comes to us as a gift that we can then share with others.